The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our special series, A Seat at the Table, where we look at the life and career of a cabinet member, I am joined by fellow podcasters who I will be sharing my research on this cabinet member with. Today, I am joined by Meredith and Dustin of the Alexander Standard podcast. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
So glad to have y'all here. I know that y'all just started your podcast. It's been about a year, right?
Yes.
I think so.
I don't know. It's funny how you gauge when you start. If it's from the first time we ever thought about doing it, we're coming up on about a year because I texted him about it February last year.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If we're based off when we first started recording, that would be sometime in summer, and releasing was sometime in summer. But from its first conception in our mind.
Yeah, I was having the same thought yesterday. I was like, when did we start? Because I know that we had it recorded and where we were writing, we're prepping for it, I think in January. Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's coming up on a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's hard to imagine. This January was actually my 6th anniversary of presidencies, and it was like, it's been 6 years. Oh, that's right. We
Wow.
have gone through 4 presidents, and
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
It's like, has it just been 3 or 4?
it's hard to fathom, but yes, you get to that point. It's like, oh
Well,
yes, okay.
well, that's cool to me because I'm always just now that we started doing it, I'm in awe of you crafty veterans like you who've been doing it for so long. I think it's really cool.
Absolutely. And speaking of, why don't y'all take a moment to share with our audience, for folks who may not have encountered you in this first year of your podcast, what the Alexander Standard is and where they can find you?
Yeah, I'll start. So Meredith and I, we are hosts of the Alexander Standard, where we discuss and rank all the successors of Alexander the Great, from Perdiccas to,
Cleopatra the 7th.
and usually that's I'm Dustin and Meredith. I already
Yeah,
did
then we
that.
kick off. Yeah. So we're one of the mini Rexy pods, based off the original Rex Factor. And if anybody would like to join us or listen to us or find us on social media, our Facebook is the Alexander Standard Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at Alexander Standard Pod. And if Twitter still exists at the release of this episode, it's at Alex Standard Pod.
And yeah, you can also email us at Alexander. Yeah, see, and I'm messing it up. Sorry, AlexanderStandardPod@gmail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're on all the major platforms.
Pretty much,
right?
yeah. I mean, the main ones being we're based off of Podbean. We're on Spotify. We're on iTunes, things like that. So
Yeah.
Nice. And I will say I have greatly enjoyed y'all's episodes thus far. It's actually a part of history that, you know, once you get past Alexander the Great, it's like, okay, well, things break apart. There's all this going on, but it's not as well explored, that period between Alexander the Great and the rise of the Roman Empire for that portion of the world. And so I've been learning so much. And so thank y'all so much. And I highly encourage the audience to check out the Alexander Standard. I will be sharing information on my social media around the release of this episode. So be sure to check it out.
Thank you so much for that. Just to agree with you, yeah, that was the main motivation for it. She introduced me to the Rexy Pods, and we were listening to Talus Rankium, and we both work in academia, and I also teach, and so it's like, well, I already like to get paid for talking about things I think are cool. Sounds like a Rexy Pod is like something right up our alley, and I was like, well, what hasn't been done? And then, like you said, I was like, well, no one talks about what happened after Alexander died, and so yeah, it just seemed like a perfect fit for us.
Absolutely. And just exploring how all of those, how the larger empire fell into these other states and what that meant and the ramifications for future history. It's really fascinating. And I can't wait to hear more. I feel like with so you think you can rule Persia has
Mhm.
started, at least in that respect, doing
Yeah,
some teasers, and I'm hearing all these figures. I'm like, oh, I can't wait for Dustin and Meredith to cover
yeah,
them. I can't wait to find out what was happening over there. So
yeah, yeah. So you think you can rule Persia? They're great. Yeah, they've yeah, exactly like you said. They're skipping. They're just by their chronology, so they're a bit ahead of us chronologically, and they've dealt with like Seleucus and stuff
Yeah,
like
they're in
that.
the
Yeah,
Seleucids right
it's
now.
so many wacky stories from this period. These people were crazy back then.
and in the time period that we're going to be discussing today, things were interesting in their own ways. Not quite as battly or fighty, but definitely some intrigue going on. And especially, so we're at the point we're talking about the Jefferson and Madison presidencies. And there's definitely some factionalism and breaking apart going on at this time.
I'm so excited.
So, with that, as per usual, I have not shared who the cabinet member is that we will be discussing. So, Meredith and Dustin, you are learning just now that we are going to be talking about William Pinkney. Have y'all heard of William Pinkney before?
I'd say no. I was trying to think if I remembered him being on like the periphery of like a totalis rankium American presidencies, and it's just not ringing a bell.
The name sounds extremely familiar, but as an ancient historian, I'll have to fall back on that because that's my excuse for like I don't know. I do ancient history. No, but like the name does sound very familiar, but I can't place it.
Well, hopefully, once we're done, you will know quite more about William Pinkney. Although I will go ahead and say before I begin, this is actually initially one of the most difficult seat at the table episodes that I started prepping for because there is so little information available on him, or at least in my
Hmm.
initial research.
Well, we know all about that. Yeah.
It was at one point, and so I usually start with some standards like the biographical directory of the US Congress. If it's a attorney general, the Justice Department, they really didn't have much. At
Wow.
one point, I could not even find the name of his parents,
Or Willie Pinky.
but I was finally able to hit on a couple of papers that were written by Richard B. Lilich and a thesis by Robert M. Ireland that proved to be a wealth of information. And so I have quite more than I initially did with like it was like 2 pages
Like
of
when
an
you
outline.
resign yourself to like a short episode, you find a thesis and you're like,
Yeah.
God.
But and I hope you agree there is a bit more to talk about William Pinkney than is typically written. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in.
Do it.
Welcome to Anthology of Heroes, the podcast that explores the most pivotal moments of history through the eyes of those who lived it. In this podcast, we don't spend our time recounting facts and dates. Instead, we follow in the footsteps of national heroes, kings, or ordinary people who lived and breathed the moments that shaped our world. We're not hemmed in by eras, borders, or religions. Instead, we seek out the tales of those who defied the odds and fought passionately for their beliefs. Whether they're right or wrong is up to you to decide. From Vercingetorix's doomed rebellion against Rome, to Osceola's unshakable war against the USA, all the way up to the inspiring Sobibor concentration camp uprising in World War II, each episode is an immersive listening experience, blending music and sound effects to really draw you into the story. Our episodes go for about 45 minutes, making them perfect for your commute, and are crafted using a wealth of historical sources, which I list on our website if you want to learn more. I'm the host, Elliot Gates, and I'm thrilled to have you joining me as we uncover history's hidden gems and illuminate the faded pages of our past. Look out for the Anthology of Heroes podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else you get your podcasts from.
William Pinkney was born on March 17th, 1764 in Annapolis, Maryland, and he was the son, I can report, of Jonathan Pinkney and Anne Rhine. So Jonathan was an immigrant from England, and Anne was his second wife. Now, supposedly, according to Ireland, through a distant ancestor, Pinkney was related to the Pinkneys that we've encountered on presidencies time and again, and that family name was spelled Pinkney, while our Pinkney is without the C. So Pinkney. So the Pinkneys, the other Pinkneys were in South Carolina. They've included a few prominent figures. We've discussed two-time unsuccessful candidate for president Charles Cotesworth Pinkney and the unsuccessful VP candidate Thomas Pinkney, who I also, in my research for the Madison presidency, he'll be making another appearance. But this was a distant branch of the family, and it doesn't seem like there's really much connection between them. But since the names are pronounced the same, spelled a little different, that was interesting that we've encountered that distant branch already.
Okay, so we do think that they are, and I might have missed this. I'm sorry, but because you mentioned like the different spelling, so is it coincidental similarities, or are we looking at confirmed, larger parts of the same family?
And so it does seem like there was some distant ancestor, and it's interesting because with spelling of names, just like with any kind of standard spelling at the time, this was the time that we were starting to get that standardization, but you would see even within families, even within closer families, they would sometimes spell the same name differently. And so it seems like with them being so distant, that resulted in a slightly different variation of the name with the Maryland Pinkneys and the South Carolina Pinkneys.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I hadn't found anything previously, but with the names being so close, it was like, that's odd that there's no connection. So it does seem like they can trace back to a common ancestor.
Especially at that point in our nation's history, there wouldn't have been that much diversification, like how many people having similar
I know.
names.
Exactly. Six degrees of the Pinkneys.
I want that as a T-shirt.
But getting back to William, he was one of four children, and according to Ireland, he was close to his two brothers throughout his life. Their home was apparently on the Severn River, and they could see Chesapeake Bay from their home. Now, as was often the case for historical figures of the time, and I think in ancient times as well, you typically don't know much about their early days, their childhood. That really wasn't seen as something important to document unless
Right.
they were prominent. They came to the throne as a baby or whatever. But, and so in this case with William Pinkney, we don't know much. We know at some point he started attending King William's School. This school, which was founded in 1696, would, a few years after Pinkney attended, be absorbed by St. John's College when it was chartered in 1784. And St. John's College is still open as a private liberal arts college with a campus in Annapolis to this day. Unfortunately, as his father was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, his property was apparently seized by authorities in Maryland. And thus, Pinkney had to leave King William School at the age of 13 as his father could no longer afford to pay his tuition and fees. But he apparently impressed his teacher, Mr. Brefhart, so much that the teacher continued to give Pinkney private lessons at his home. Now, we have somebody from a loyalist family, and they did suffer because of that.
And it was his dad that was a loyalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yeah, so I wonder if it's something like his youth when all this was going on kind of shields him in the future.
This is very
Exactly.
fascinating. Yeah, this is very fascinating. I mean, this is the obvious thing, but I've never thought about that before, like the implications of previous dispositions and loyalties on later careers. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, of course, with this being Pinkney's teenage years, the Revolutionary War raged up and down the eastern seaboard. But as you would expect from somebody whose father was a loyalist, I found no indication that Pinkney, who would have been 17 at the time of the Battle of Yorktown, served in any capacity during that conflict on either side. But it's definitely understandable why he wasn't serving under the Patriot forces. Now, as the nation gained its independence, Pinkney was focused on determining how he would make his way in the world. It appears that at one point he studied medicine, but he never set up practice as a medical doctor. Instead, at the instigation of one of the leading lawyers in Maryland, Samuel Chase, he turned his attention to legal studies. as was often the case at the time, Pinkney read the law by serving under an established lawyer. This lawyer would have guided Pinkney in his reading of legal treaties, as well as possibly works on other subjects. And Pinkney would have been expected, likely, to help the lawyer as clerk. Now, we don't know any details except that it was in Chase's law office that Pinkney read the law until at least early 1785. By that time, Pinkney was ready to set out on his own, but though he had been admitted to the bar, it doesn't seem like he had an opportunity to practice law until he established his own legal practice in Harford County, which is just to the northeast of Baltimore, in 1786. So, he had to move and establish his practice elsewhere before he could really get going.
Yeah.
Now, just as Pinkney was doing, around this time, the new nation was trying to determine its path forward. In 1787, a year after Pinkney became a lawyer, a convention was held in Philadelphia. You may have heard of it. And this convention put forward a new plan of government in the U.S. Constitution.
It's called Constitution Con.
Constitution Con.
Constitution Con 1787. Come and meet all of your favorites. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin.
We'll have booths set up everywhere, See, I can't believe that's not something.
Constitution
It
Con.
has to, it will be now.
We'll go look for it.
It's going to be now. Yeah. It's a gold
It
mine.
should be. I'd be glad to go.
I know.
Get your powdered wigs,
It's like coming summer 2024.
I'd be like, 1789 is coming in 2024.
You heard it here first, audience. Let's make it happen.
I've got a lot of Americanist friends. I'm gonna start using them. And I was like, why don't we do a Constitution Con, guys?
I love it. I love it. So naturally, with the Constitution, it had to go to the states for ratification. And of course, Maryland would have to discuss this proposed national constitution as well. And for the state convention, Pinkney was elected as a delegate from Harford County. Now, it seems that early on in his career as a politician, Pinkney gained a reputation for his oratorical skills. And it seems like at this convention that he was on display. He was one of the folks who was debating the Constitution. On April 28th, 1788, the convention, by a vote of 63 to 11, ratified the U.S. Constitution. And apparently the 63 who had voted for the Constitution then went on to sign a written copy of the Constitution, and Maryland's was the only state ratifying convention where this was done. I was really interested to see if I could find out who the signatories were, because I could not find how Pinkney voted. And so if he was one of the 63, then that means he voted for the Constitution. On a website from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it noted that of the 4 delegates from Harford County, 1 did vote for ratification, the other 3 did not. So I wasn't able to track down whether he voted for or against, but there is the possibility that he did. There's also a 3 in 4 chance that he didn't. So.
Yeah.
What are those odds again? 25% chance he didn't vote for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if anybody knows where I can find a copy of, or just a list of who signed the Constitution in Maryland, let me know. But regardless, go ahead.
So my first question is, remind me again when he was born?
It is 1764.
And he had a law practice in 1786?
Yes.
At 22 years old?
You got to get moving back then.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm 38. I'm just getting reminders.
You're writing your conclusion right now.
I'm just thinking like in Alexander and like in the Hamilton play, it's just there was that song like, why are you always writing like you're running out of time? And like, these guys are go-getters.
Yeah.
They're just writing constantly. He's got a law practice at 22, and I'm 38, and I'm still writing a crappy dissertation.
It's not crappy.
It's beautiful. We don't have any idea of where, and this may be repetitive, we don't have any idea on what side of the argument Pinkney fell on the Constitution?
No.
Oh, wow.
No. Yeah, that was one of the things that I wasn't able to find.
Wow.
It was This, like I said, this was an interesting one, and there are just some gaps that it's like there's got to be some information out there. Just
Yeah.
I wasn't able to find it, but I would
Yeah.
love to hear how, if he was that one person who voted for it from that county. But yeah, in terms of his age, it really was a time that folks, because the population wasn't the size that it is, of course, nowadays. It was
Yeah.
a smaller population, and so it was expected that folks would get that early start. Not everybody did,
Okay.
but especially with this series, you see folks who are rising to the cabinet level. They are typically go-getters of some sort,
Yeah.
whether it's through their career, through politics or whatever, they are typically more of the go-getters. And so you
Yeah.
do see this with Pinkney that this early on, he's establishing his law practice, he's in the state constitutional convention. This is a very early start and he's definitely on the rise.
This is impressive. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, though we don't know exactly how he voted, the Constitution did go into effect. The new government was started. George Washington was chosen as the first president. And meanwhile, Pinkney, he was on his rise at the same time. And that's one of the interesting things about this that, he's rising just as the new nation is getting going, is really getting a firm plan together. And so, as he was well on his way in establishing himself professionally, Pinkney's mind also turned to family. And so, in the same year that the new constitutional government began, 1789, he and Anne Maria Rogers were wed.
Mm.
The two would have 10 children total, with the first being born the same year as they were wed, while the last that I was able to find was born in 1807. So this is a span of roughly, so that must be 17, 18 years that
Mm.
these 10 children were born.
10 kids.
Yeah.
10 kids. Of those children, at least 6 of them, from what I was able to find, lived to adulthood. Wasn't able to find anything on the others. And that's one of those things, sometimes it's hard to track down the children. And there was, unfortunately, child mortality was pretty prevalent at the time. So
I was actually going to ask that. Yeah.
yeah. So it could have been that they passed away. Sometimes the records they just didn't really record quite as much. But it does seem like at least 6 of them lived to adulthood. Now, Pinkney would start to rise in political circles after his service in the state convention. That same year, he was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates and would serve in that body until 1792. Now, here's one of these things that sound odd as citizens of the 21st century. It appears that there is some overlap in his service in the state legislature and in the National Congress. So I said that he served in the Maryland House of Delegates until 1792. In 1790, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and served in the Second Congress starting in March 1791. So it's weird that
Yeah.
and we've had this with some of the other figures in the seat at the table series. They'll serve in 2 or 3 different offices at the same time, but especially like state and federal legislative service at the same time. That's kind of odd.
Yeah, I mean, do you kind of chalk that up to the thing we were talking about before that like the population wasn't as big, so like maybe you didn't have a ton of your best and brightest still, and it was better to have them overlap some, or was that just more the idea of like until it happened, no one ever thought to write down that that's not allowed, or
That's what I would imagine.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, and there were some discrepancies like that. Like, for example, I think it was Henry Clay was actually serving in the US Senate, even though he wasn't 30 years old at that point, which is the requirement for the Senate.
Really?
Yes.
Now, see, that's fascinating to me.
bad.
Well, I mean, even though we're doing, ancient Hellenistic history, which is Greek-ish, my field is Roman history, and I study actually Roman constitutional thought. And what I find fascinating about that is, I'm actually my dissertation is talking about extraordinary commands, which are essentially the question of constitutional innovations and exceptions versus deviations.
Wow.
And I agree with Meredith. I was thinking the same thing you're thinking of. Like, it is the case that a lot of times when we're talking about constitutions or constitutional states, they are muddling their way through some of the things that later on look very contradictory or deviations to us or illegal. However, if Mr. Clay, I'm sure on the Constitution, I'm pretty sure it actually gives that age requirement, and so if he's
Mhm.
serving in violation of that, that's different. That's not
Yeah.
just making our way through it and figuring out along the way. That's illegal.
That's Henry Clay just saying, "I'm just gonna do
Yeah.
it."
I don't
Yeah.
care.
Who cares
I
about the
don't care.
Constitution?
Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, I guess.
Exactly.
They didn't ask how old I was.
Yeah.
Well, and I think he was like it was like a month or 2 shy, but still, it's like
Yeah,
that's
but
in the Constitution. That's
That's
technically
right.
technically.
and in this case, and there really weren't those laws that were set up to prohibit folks from serving in certain capacities. You know,
Right.
there's some, but not as much as we have nowadays. And it was also the case that, you know, A, you had a smaller pool of folks from whom you were choosing. B, they could work things out because it wasn't, you know, the US Congress wasn't in session the majority of the year at this point. It was just, you know, you would have a session for 3 or 4 months, then everybody would go home. And so you had that time to attend to private business or serve in another capacity, you know, serve in this other office. It wasn't the offices didn't have as much immediate responsibility as they do nowadays. So they were able to kind of balance the offices.
Right.
And especially in Pinkney's case, we will be talking more about this shortly. But even though he was elected to the US House of Representatives, his congressional tenure was not a long one because apparently there were some questions about his eligibility. Now, I didn't see any confirmation of this. I did wonder if it was was there something written somewhere that he couldn't serve in the state legislature? All that I could find was that there were some questions about his eligibility.
Hmm.
And so it's again like one of those mysteries that came up and it's like I'd love to be able to explore more, but considering how hard it was to find
Yeah.
details of him just in general, this is one that I just wasn't able to solve, and hopefully somebody will one of these days.
This is why
Mhm.
archiving is important because these
Exactly.
little details matter. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. 'Cause either right now he's that, like, one standout that voted to ratify the Constitution, or he's, like, one of the guys that was against it. Don't know.
I'm still sitting here astonished that no one's bringing up the fact that he was from a loyalist family.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly.
But for all we know, this can come up. So
Mhm.
we will stay tuned.
Exactly. So, you know, he started in March 1791. He actually resigned his House seat that November, so he didn't even last a year.
Hmm.
Mm.
Now, avoiding the same issue again, when Pinkney was asked to serve in the Maryland Executive Council in 1792, he resigned from the State House. And so for the next 3 years, he just served in the Executive Council. And it seems that while he was serving in the council, he and his family moved to Annapolis, which would make sense. That's the capital of Maryland, so it would make sense for him to be there. And in 1794, he was chosen as mayor of that city,
Of Annapolis?
of Annapolis. So, you know, while he's serving on the state council, he's also serving as mayor. Now, he'd only serve as mayor until 1795 when he was elected back into the state House of Delegates. But this period of service, too, would be short because soon after, Pinckney received an invitation to serve President George Washington.
That's so random.
Yeah.
I'm just not seeing the connection of the dots.
And yet,
That
and
he's
yet,
bouncing around these offices and
Yeah,
yeah.
not staying in them very long. His eligibility is, like, questionable, and then it's like, "Would you like to come to the top, sir?" Like,
Yeah, I mean, but it also does just imply, or rather, the implication is, nevertheless, that he had that much of a reputation. Like,
Mhm.
I get what you're saying, man. Is this is like how did, like, what's the connection? I'm not getting it, but the implication, something was there. somebody looked at Washington and said, Willie Pinky, that's what you need.
This is the guy.
That's what we're missing.
I want a guy who can't keep a job. 'Cause he's flexible that way.
we know the perfect guy for you.
Yeah.
He's like, of course he's willing to come to us. He moves offices every year. Like,
Yes.
I mean, he's been in this office for like 2 months. He's ready to go.
He's ready. He's looking for the next best thing.
So this is 1794. He is invited to work with George Washington.
So let's talk about this. So, first of all, just to provide some background, so Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay had negotiated a peace treaty with Great Britain in 1794.
Jay Treaty.
The Jay Treaty, exactly, that called for a commission composed of British and American delegates to hear arbitration claims by American and British shippers regarding losses that they experienced during the Revolutionary War due to the other side confiscating ships and goods and claiming them as prizes. So this is the part of the Jay Treaty that's trying to clear up some of the remaining mess of the Revolutionary War, some of those outstanding questions and problems. Now, after the treaty's ratification, Washington in 1795 decided to nominate Pinkney along with Christopher Gore of Massachusetts as the American delegates, and both agreed to serve. Now, and here's a possible reason that Pinkney was seen as being a good person for this, as well as somebody from Massachusetts. So, considering the states that they're from, these are big states for shipping, and especially for international shipping, trading across the Atlantic. And likewise, because they were so big in shipping and the merchant industry, maritime law was important in both of those states. You would have more cases than you would in other states that didn't have as many shipping concerns. So it would make sense to have somebody from these two states in this arbitration claim process. Thus, 1795, he was nominated, confirmed, and Pinkney traveled to London, where he would remain. Brace yourselves. He actually stayed at this until 1804.
Oh my God.
He finally found an office that he wanted to stay in for a while.
I mean, if someone gave me the option right now, they're like, would you like to go work in London for like X amount of years? I'd be like, let's go.
The answer is
I'm
always
ready.
yes.
And he said yes to this opportunity. Now, as noted by Ireland, quote, Pinkney's tenure as a commissioner was in a real sense a continuation of his legal career, for during this period he gained a familiarity with the law of prizes, an achievement which would stand him in good stead in years to come. An examination of Pinkney's opinions delivered as a commissioner under the Jay Treaty reveals that while in London, he learned his prize law well. So he already came with kind of a basis of knowledge, but this helped him to build upon that. And this became kind of a specialty in his legal career as he moved on. When their work at times devolved into a stalemate, including a 3-year suspension of the commission. So there was 3 years that even though he was there, supposed to be in this commission, nothing was happening. Pinkney used the opportunity to continue his legal studies and to listen to the arguments of the preeminent legal minds in Britain.
You got Meredith cracking up over
No,
here.
I'm just laughing that we're like, wow, he stayed in this job for a long time. And then it's like, well, he wasn't doing anything for 3 years. That's why I was laughing.
Actually, I have a similar conspiracy theory. What if it is not the fact that he was renowned and had a good reputation, was sought after? What if this was a way of getting rid of him? It's just like, send him to London, and he gets forgotten while he's over there. Because it takes time for these things to go across the Atlantic, and so there's a lot of times he's just like sending off a letter saying, "What do now?" And he's waiting for 3 years. Meanwhile, there's stuff happening on our side. They just forgot about him.
Oh, I just found this letter from that guy that we sent to London a few years back.
Ultimate
Whoops.
unread text. Or the ultimate like email in your inbox that gets buried. I forgot to reply. Willie Pink's gonna be mad.
I know, it's like when Google's like, it's been 10 days. Would you like to reply? You're like, oh God, I'm sorry.
That's why it's called the Pinkney alert.
Yeah.
That's why it's called the Pinkney alert.
Whoops.
I had an epiphany while we were talking about this. this may have no bearing, maybe pure speculation, but I'm still stuck on this loyalist family thing. Loyalist family. What if that's one of the reasons he was selected? His family would have he would kind of have, well, how would I say this? Just some sort of he might be just kind of more welcomed and like
Mm,
on that to serve on that commission. Like, oh yeah, Willie Pink, yeah, his family was a loyalist. We'll talk to him.
maybe.
Maybe.
Well, and that was another thing that I had a question about and wasn't able to find anything, his parents. What happened to them after the war? I wasn't really able to find anything about them. With loyalists, there were at times they would just go off back to England after the
Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
We actually did see this in the Edmund Randolph episode because even though Randolph and some of his family were patriots, they also had some folks that were loyalists, including he actually did have his father was a loyalist and they went back to England. He ended up having to take over kind of the family affairs in Virginia while his family was on the other side of the Atlantic. So I was wondering if maybe his family moved there. Maybe that was part of the reason why he stayed around so long.
Yeah.
Can't confirm that. That's one of the
Right.
mysteries of William Pinkney, but that would make sense.
The many mysteries of William Pinkney.
But we do know that he at least, whereas some folks may have taken the opportunity to just, oh, well, I don't have anything to do. Let's party.
Yeah.
He at least was productive. He did his legal studies. If you're in London with these preeminent law courts, this is the place to learn. So he did take advantage of that. But finally, in early fall 1804, the commission finished its work, and by late November, he was back at home in Maryland. Now, his time away had convinced Pinkney that the time had come to move from Annapolis to the larger city of Baltimore, which was quickly becoming, quote, the leading commercial center of the state. And, as we were saying earlier, after London, yeah, you could see he's probably not wanting to go back to quiet little Annapolis, even though it was the state capital. It really wasn't that big of a city. You'd want to be in a bigger city. Baltimore's the place. Now, Pinkney's return to the States would see him break his ties with his mentor and the person who helped him get his start in the law, Samuel Chase. In the intervening years, while Pinkney was off in Britain, Chase had been appointed to the Supreme Court and ruled from the bench with a decidedly Federalist bent. Now, I should note here, it wasn't uncommon for judges to be partisan on the bench. That was actually more the norm than a deviation. However, for Democratic Republicans, Chase presented an easy target. They wanted to reform the judiciary, remove the Federalist judges and their Federalist ilk. And so Chase became a target for them. And thus, he was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. As his trial before the Senate was coming up around the time that Pinkney returned to the U.S., Chase turned his protege to serve on his defense team. Yes, Dustin.
We happen to know any grounds for the impeachment? I mean, the motivation of getting rid of the Federalists. Yeah, I mean, I accept that, but on paper they have to put something.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And with the Chase impeachment, we covered it in the narrative series, so I don't want to go into too many details here, but they did draw up articles of impeachment and they tried to tie it to like some of his rulings, saying, was this really a sound legal judgment? They had a couple of other things, but by and large, even trying to make it as legitimate as possible, ultimately Chase was acquitted because it was clear this was just a partisan gain. The reason they went after Chase is that they had successfully removed a lower federal judge, John Pickering. And Pickering, this was more justified. Like, Pickering was actually drunk on the bench and was berating people, was just it was time for him to go.
Yeah.
It was understandable that he should be removed. But with Chase, it was just too far. They could see this was just because he was a Federalist.
I can see with Pickering, it's just like objection. You're the judge. I object to myself. Once again,
Don't tell me what to do. Just go
Out
lay
of
down a
yeah.
bit.
No, I think it's like a bad sign, like when you go Pickering and Dustin and I both go, "Oh," like
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
like in the
they
back.
know. We know that name.
We know that name.
Yeah, that was not a bright moment, but
Make a
yeah,
joke.
so go ahead.
No, I was just gonna make a joke. Go ahead.
So, Chase is coming up for the impeachment trial. He's trying to build his defense team. Of course, he would draw on this young protege, this person that he had helped to get his start. Pinkney, however, was a committed Democratic Republican, and
Oh.
thus he said no.
Mm-hmm.
Now, while Pinkney, quote, argued that his refusal to aid Chase was prompted by a desire to set his affairs in order after a long absence from Maryland, he was forced to issue a public statement defending himself in a local paper, and Chase and his associates would never forgive Pinkney for this slight. I mean, that's pretty rough. If this is somebody
Yeah.
who really helped you out, helped you to get your start, and it's their time of need and you say no, that's
So in the paper that you're talking about, the statement that was made was that Pinkney making that statement?
yes. Because, it seems like there was an uproar. It's like, dude, really? Really, you're gonna do this to your mentor, this guy who really helped you to get your start?
Mm-hmm.
And he tried to use the excuse, well, I've got a lot going on. I can't really do this right now. But, you know, it seems like there was some backlash on him.
That's interesting that there was so much backlash that Pinkney saw fit to actually explain himself on a public forum, such as the newspaper.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, as I said, with the Chase impeachment trial, he was ultimately acquitted. He wasn't removed. He was able to continue on and actually continued on for quite a number of years in the Supreme Court. Going back to Pinkney, Ireland writes that at this point in his career, based on the limited number of cases he appeared in, and that most involved multiple legal representatives on either side, it, quote, suggests that he limited his practice to cases involving either complex legal problems, large sums of money, or both. So it sounds like he was doing well enough that he was able to say, well, unless this is interesting or there's a lot of money involved, no, I'll pass. I'll give it to somebody else.
Yeah, that is interesting because with the short stints in the other position, the time I brought and everything like that, it kind of begs the questions like, where is the money coming from? That
I was thinking the same thing,
Yeah.
especially in those
Yeah.
3 years when when the Trade Treaty Commission was just on hold. It's like, who's paying him?
Mhm.
Exactly. Again, one of the mysteries
Yeah.
of William Pinkney. But it wouldn't be long before he was called back to public service. In December 1805, Pinkney was appointed as the Attorney General of the state of Maryland, succeeding Luther Marden, who had served in the post for 27 years. Ireland notes that, quote, Pinkney accepted the position with reluctance, believing that its responsibilities would be personally inconvenient and disadvantageous.
Okay, I'm not liking Pinkney anymore.
He might actually have to do some work.
Yes, I'm getting this impression. Yeah, it's just I don't want to do stuff.
I might have to turn down that case that involves large sums of money to
Well,
do
I'm
this
just
public
sitting
service.
here, I'm like, is the wife secretly wealthy or not?
Yeah.
Not like even secret, but just lost to us in the records that she had a ton of money and he didn't have to do anything.
Now, not surprising with William Pinkney, we have no details about his tenure in this office, as, quote, there existed no statute delineating specific responsibilities, and none of the papers of the office had been preserved from that time. It does not seem that he represented the state in court during his tenure, but we can imagine that he may have given legal advice to the state governor, other state executive officials, and the state General Assembly. As a private lawyer, though, Pinkney did make his first appearance before the U.S. Supreme Court in February 1806.
That's
Yeah.
awkward.
That would be awkward, you know. Here he comes in and Chase is just sitting there glaring.
Fancy seeing you for the
Yeah.
first time. I've been here for years.
I'm still in my seat. No thanks to you.
Like, well, the prodigal son returns.
Guys, I can tell you how I'm going to rule in this one.
Mhm.
But soon enough, Pinkney would be called upon to serve again abroad, representing the United States. This time, the Jefferson administration in April 1806 asked Pinkney to serve alongside James Monroe as a minister extraordinary and plenipotentiary to negotiate with the British government over maritime disputes, particularly over the issue of impressment.
Mm.
And so this was a time impressment was becoming a big issue. Basically, the British Navy would have American ships, they would board the ships, they would search, and they would say, oh, well, this person's a deserter from the British Navy. We're taking them. In some cases, it was legitimate. In other cases, it was not somebody who had served in the British Navy. The Navy was just desperate for sailors. And besides the fact, it was violating the sovereignty of the United States to have them just board American vessels whenever they wanted. So this was a big issue. Now, Monroe, who was already in London as the minister resident, was initially resentful of Pinkney's appointment as he took it as representing the Jefferson administration's lack of confidence in his diplomatic abilities, and thus it was a personal slight. He was actually close to Jefferson and then Secretary of State James Madison. He was like, guys, y'all don't trust me enough to do this. You have this lack of confidence in me that you're sending this guy from Maryland. But despite his concerns over his political future, Monroe greeted Pinkney warmly upon his arrival in London in mid-June, and by all accounts, the two men did work well together. It took months of work, but finally, on January 3rd, 1807, Monroe and Pinkney were able to report back to Secretary of State Madison that they had concluded a treaty with the British government. However, in what both considered a misstep by the administration, after President Jefferson and Secretary Madison reviewed the negotiated treaty that Pinkney and Monroe had put all this time and effort into, the President and the Secretary of State decided that the treaty was unacceptable as it did not include anything about the impressment issue, and thus they filed it away without sending it to the Senate for its consideration for ratification.
Okay. So they're sent over there to make a treaty about the impressment issue, and the treaty they come up with doesn't even mention impressment.
No.
Is it impressment?
Impressment.
I'm sure it was oppressive.
Yes.
It was oppressive and not impressive.
Wow, I'm sorry. What? I know you've heard our shows, so you know that I can be kind of sharp tongued with these guys. What a loser!
Monroe helped fail this time too.
Okay, that's fair, but we're looking for correlation here. Like Pinkney, wherever he touches, just it doesn't turn out well.
If it doesn't turn out well, it just doesn't turn out anything. Like nothing happens. Nothing happens.
Yes, it was like we're gonna sit over there to talk about what was the other one? The J Treaty. It was just like, nothing happened. We're gonna sit over there for impressment, and nothing happened.
I do want to know. Maybe I'll peruse in my free time. I feel like the treaty was still probably pretty long. And so it's like, what did it say? And what did we come back with? And like, what page was the person on when they realized, wait, this is never covered?
Because they don't have a whole F here.
No.
Yeah, like, so they're getting through because these things are just remarkably long-winded.
It's like we've got the preamble of where we are, who is here.
Yeah. And it's just like, Pink Willie, you didn't say the word impressment at all.
It's like when you're reading a book and you flip the page and you're like, what did I read on the previous page? How many times do you go back before you're confident? No, this really said nothing about impressment.
Hold on. This footnote references the endnote, which references the article that the original footnote was in. Well, And to be fair to Monroe and Pinkney, so this and that correlation with the Jay Treaty, Dustin, is very apt here because it was kind of the same thing. You know, they got there and the British government, they brought up, they were like, you know, we need to talk about impressment. And the British government was like, no, we're not talking about that. Here are the couple of things that we will talk about, but that's not one of them. And so the thought was just like with the Jay Treaty, and that was John Jay's justification for it. He was like, no, I did not get some of the major issues we wanted to talk about, but this is a start. You know, right now we're at the point,
Yeah.
relations are bad, they're getting worse. This is a way to kind of, you know, take some of the heat off, some of the pressure, and we can come back to the negotiating table. And that was what Pinkney and Monroe said. They were like, this is the reason why. We know it doesn't have impressment. We're sorry. We'll go back to the table. But Jefferson and Madison, unlike Washington with the Jay Treaty, they were like, no, this is nothing. We're not doing this.
Yeah.
And so they just filed it away in a drawer, and that was it. It didn't even go to the Senate.
It does actually raise a good point with the idea that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. Well, both of you can, 'cause Meredith, you know more about this than even I do. With the Revolution, my understanding is it wasn't really our martial prowess that won the day. It was more like, okay, we're tricky, we're smart, but also England wasn't able to put the full brunt of their empire's army on us.
And
And so,
because you also had France join
right,
in, so then that's a war on two fronts.
right. So we were really just kind of able to skirt through. We were lucky. And then my understanding is it the Treaty of Paris
Mhm.
for the end of the revolution?
Yes.
Is it my understanding is that we also got lucky there, really through British incompetence, that we were able to get the favorable conditions that we were able to get. But the reminder there I'm seeing in the Jay Treaty and this and in the impressment negotiations is Britain kind of reminding us like we don't have to do anything that you want because at the end of the day, you can't back up anything. You don't have the military power.
Yeah.
You don't have anything to bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's
Yeah.
just the reminder that like you don't have a negotiating position. You don't have leverage.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a reminder of like the weakness of our fledgling republic at this time.
Look at all those trips
You
to
like?
Colonial Williamsburg paid off.
That is
Look
yeah.
at you.
I love it. Yeah, and exactly. Exactly, Dustin. It was really American persistence, you know.
Mm-hmm.
In the revolution, it wasn't that we really won a great deal. It was just that we weren't completely decimated and we were able to come back. We continued with an army.
Yeah.
And likewise, you see in the diplomacy of the time and of the early republic, it really is coming back again and again and again and just waiting for the right person to negotiate with, who's going to be willing to talk about impressment, who's going to be willing to negotiate a treaty that gives a little more to the US, and slowly over time building towards something greater.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
And that's, you know, Monroe and Pinkney, they were negotiating with that in mind. And Jefferson and Madison were like, no, it's impressment or nothing. And so with that, they sent them new instructions and they were like, no, really, you need to talk about impressment. We don't
Yeah.
want a treaty without impressment. And of course, these demands from the Jefferson administration, they were unrealistic because, to your point, Dustin, we had no leverage.
Mm,
We had no leverage. If the British government said, we don't want to talk about impressment, that was it.
yeah.
In the negotiations, and they're not going to suffer.
Yeah.
The US was.
Yeah, because Britain's response could be like if the Americans had tried to push back and say, no, you need to stop, kidnapping our sailors and impressing them into British service, the British is like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Do you want to go to war with us? I don't think you want that.
Have you seen our Navy?
Yeah, yeah, like Yeah, we're not worried about the American Navy now.
It's like, and France is preoccupied.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm always surprised that Britain didn't. I know this happens essentially in the War of 1812. I'm always surprised Britain didn't just like wait, be like, wait, what a minute? No, they're not independent. Go back. I'm surprised they didn't just come back and mop us up. But I think that's kind of the implicit message here when they're not even
Yeah,
talking about impressment.
exactly. Exactly. And so you can imagine, Monroe is frustrated. He's been abroad for years. This is an extreme failure. And so a frustrated Monroe decides to head for home. And so Pinkney was named as the minister resident in London. So he became the United States permanent diplomatic representative in that foreign capital. So he's back in London again. And Pinkney would remain in this role for the next few years, trying but failing to make any diplomatic inroads with the British government. Now, part of this, if they had already negotiated a treaty that the American government said, no, we don't care about that, you can see why the British were like, why are we wasting our time? If we negotiate this, your government's not going to accept it. So they really didn't have much motivation to do it. But then also, there was some turbulence in the British government. There was some changeover from one prime minister to another. Things were shifting in London as well, so that made it difficult. But Pinkney, in dealing with one prime minister after another, he only found a reluctance to move on the key issues from the American point of view. He was never able to find that one person who he could actually work with. Now, Pinkney continued in this post when James Madison succeeded Thomas Jefferson as president, but when this new administration sent instructions to Pinkney to request the recall of a rather odious new British minister sent to Washington, the British government responded by agreeing to recall the minister, but informing Pinkney that they would not be replacing him with a diplomat of equivalent rank. Rather, the British representative in the US would be the lesser office of chargé d'affaires. Now, in diplomatic parlance, this was an intentional slight. They were saying, okay, well, we just sent this guy as our minister to you. You're saying you're rejecting him. So, again, kind of like with the treaty, well, obviously you don't want to negotiate it with us. So, we'll just send off this lower official and show you just how we think of you.
So this was a slap in the face to
To us.
America.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
exactly. Exactly. And Pinkney worked to get the British government to change their minds on this, but they're like, no, we don't really care. We've got stuff going on our own. We don't really care. Finally, he pulled an ace out of his sleeve. The Madison administration had authorized him to vacate his post and return home anytime he wanted. Thus, in the spring of 1811, Pinkney made his intentions known to the British ministry. Again, in diplomatic parlance, this was Pinkney saying, you know what? Screw you guys. I'm going home. And
South Park reference, yeah. You guys, I'm going home.
and this made them pause. They're like, oh, I mean, hey, hold on, guy. We were just playing. Seriously, we don't want to break diplomatic talks. We don't want to, completely turn off diplomacy. We're not there yet. And so within 48 hours, they named a new British minister to take up residence in Washington. But in terms of Pinkney, he was ready to go.
Okay, I'm curious why, since we're talking about like the realities of power when it comes to American and British negotiations at this time, hypothetically, why would England care if Pinkney was going to resign? Because they don't have any incentive to make a lot allotments or concessions to America. And like, who cares if their American diplomat resigns? Why would they care?
So part of this was, and this is in the larger context of the Napoleonic Wars. So
Mm.
Britain and France have been engaged in war for as long as people could think.
Ever since there was war.
Yeah. They had been engaged in war for quite a while. And they were hearing talks, like there was news, coming across the Atlantic that Americans were not too happy with Britain. They really hadn't been for, since the Revolutionary War, but it was really starting to ramp up after, we had the Chesapeake Leopard affair. We had all these incidents of the British and Americans having these standoffs, having issues, impressment, and the American public and prominent leaders were starting to get to the point that they were starting to talk about war. Now, for the British, it may not mean so much, except for the fact that they did have a colony that was within spitting distance of major parts of the eastern seaboard. So Canada was still there, and they didn't want anything to happen to Canada. Because at this point, with them being so engaged in war with France, they were having to direct as much resource to that because, I mean, this was Napoleon, this was the Grande Armée, they were having to throw everything they could into that.
Yeah, I feel like this was like not the typical war with France that they were used to. It's like
Exactly.
this was difficult.
Exactly. And Napoleon was doing all he could to keep goods from getting to Britain. So they were struggling with that. The Americans, when there wasn't an embargo going on the American side, they were at least getting some goods and services from America. So that they didn't want to shut that down. Likewise, they couldn't really afford to send much military resources, many troops or anything to America to defend Canada. What was there was all they had. So even though for the most part they were dismissive of the US at the time, they were like, "Oh, you and your army." Still, they didn't want to get into another conflict because they couldn't focus their attention on it. And so they were like, "Okay, let's just, let's walk this back. We're not going to talk about impressment,
Yeah.
but we don't want to break off diplomatic ties."
So it's what's known in French as a bargaining chip.
Exactly.
My thing, whenever I coin a phrase, like in French, that's known. Yeah. America has a bargaining chip now.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. So with Pinkney, him making this threat, they were able to get that little concession from the British. Okay, we will send another minister. But Pinkney was done. He was ready to go home. So by June, he was back in Maryland. Ironically enough, on the same day Pinkney arrived in Annapolis, the new British minister to the US, Augustus Foster, arrived at the same port on a different ship. And so these two men were able to exchange pleasantries, hey, welcome to America, welcome back to America. But while Foster was proceeding to Washington to take up his new post, Pinkney was going home. But if Pinkney thought his return to the US would end his public service, he had another thing coming. In September 1811, he was elected to the Maryland State Senate and before long took up his seat in that body. But only a few months after his election, Pinkney received an offer for another position. So here we go again. Pinkney changing offices.
I wish I had this guy's luck.
To consolidate all those different 401k accounts is going to be really
Oh my
annoying.
god, dude. I have a part-time gig, because PhD program, and it's hell every year with H&R Block. I can imagine what Willie Pink was dealing with.
This took up a good portion of his time just trying to figure all that out.
All the W-2s I have to.
But as we discussed in his episode, the attorney general that Madison had inherited from Jefferson, Caesar A. Rodney, due to what he felt was a slight against him on Madison's part, had decided that the time had come to leave the cabinet in early December 1811. Thus, on December 6th, the president wrote to Pinkney that, quote, "I'm desirous of obtaining for our country the services promised it by the talents and dispositions which you would carry into the vacancy. Unwilling, however, to present your name to the Senate without your permission, I must ask the favor of you to intimate by the gentleman charged with this whether I may have the pleasure of taking that liberty. With a hope that it will be allowed me, I tender you assurances of great esteem and best regards." On December 8th, Pinkney replied that, quote, "My professional prospects here are as flattering as I could have hoped or desired, and they assure me that, if I am spared for a few years, I may yet redeem the negligence of the past.
So he knows he's a loser.
He's like, I need to get some stuff together. It's going to take me a few years, but I'm going to get there. And I continue. This is a direct quote. But the office of Attorney General will not much interfere with them, if indeed it will not rather make them better. At any rate, it will place me nearer to you. And while it will prove that I am still honored with your confidence and friendship, will afford me an opportunity of giving my humble assistance to your endeavors for the public good. I am ready, therefore, as I mentioned to Mr. Forrest, to accept the appointment whenever it may be your pleasure to make it, and to repair to Washington as soon as it will be thought expedient.
So does he mean he thinks it's not going to be that big of a
Yeah.
workload?
Did this dude just
Yes.
say he can be in the cabinet and be AG at the same time?
Well, no, he's being invited to join the cabinet as AG. He's saying, I can wrap up all my stuff in Maryland and do this because being on the cabinet's not going to be that labor intensive.
Yeah, remind me what his previous job was in September.
So his previous job was the Maryland State Senate.
Okay, so he's
Yeah.
Okay, so he's not saying I can be a Maryland State Senator and Attorney General at the same time, is he?
No.
No,
Okay.
he's just saying, like, I got so much on my plate, but I don't think being Attorney General is going to be that time consuming. So sure.
Okay, all right,
Exactly.
That's still stupid. So I so yeah, my feet, even though I was wrong about the AG thing and this, my feelings still work because I was like, when I heard that, I'm like, this guy.
Well, and I will say, and we will talk about this more in a minute, there is some justification to his feelings on this, but it's also, I mean, you're just going right out and saying, I know
Yeah,
it's not going to be a big
yeah,
deal, and
yeah,
I can do that.
right.
Yeah, it's one thing to look at a position and say, like, that hasn't been very high stress for people in the past, but that's not what you put in the cover letter of, like, I slept well at night. I'd love a try. Like,
It reminds me, like, one time when I was getting my master's, I was trying to just find like a side gig, and someone had told me about, like, he's like, "Oh, dude, this dream job for you. It was a security position at some place, but it was like so low key. You don't have to do anything. You could do work, you could read, you could grade papers there." And it probably was true. But what I probably shouldn't have done during the interview was ask, would it be okay if I like read and grade papers while I'm here? Because that just basically communicated the wrong impression to that guy. So I feel like that's what he's doing. It's just like, well, I guess AG can't be that hard, sure.
And now, surprisingly, it did work out for Pinkney, even after he received this letter that, oh, well, this is an easy job, right? Because his name was sent to the Senate and a quick confirmation was secured. And so on December 11th, 1811, William Pinkney became the 7th U.S. Attorney General. Now, I did say that there is some justification on Pinkney's part because at the time, the position of Attorney General was quite a bit different than what we think of nowadays.
mhm.
So at this point, there was no Justice Department. So, and that actually wouldn't come until the Grant presidency. So post Civil War, there would be no Justice Department. It was just the Attorney General. And because of that, there weren't that many official duties. The only official duties of the Attorney General at the time were to represent the federal government in cases before the Supreme Court and supply legal counsel to the presidential administration as needed. Thus, this is typically considered a part-time role. Yeah, Dustin.
I love that last comment, by the way. Like, it was technically a part-time gig. I did not know that there was no Justice Department at this time. Now,
Yeah.
and then as you said that, it reminded me, but wasn't this the administration? We're talking about the Madison administration, right?
Mhm.
So this
Mhm.
would have been the administration that actually, where there was the court case that established the principle of judicial review in America, right? Because Marbury versus Madison.
Yeah, so it was actually in the Jefferson administration. So
Oh,
even before this.
oh, that's so this we had just established the idea of judicial review in America, and now but we still have like no Justice Department.
Exactly. Well, and the thing is, like, we did have like district attorneys,
Uh-huh.
federal district attorneys, but they were separate. They weren't, it wasn't that the attorney general was kind of administering the district attorneys, and all their correspondence with the administration went through the State Department.
So I'm going to go ahead and throw myself onto my sword and ask the dumbest question in the world, but I have to concede I've never known. Oh God, I'm so embarrassed preemptively. What's the implication here of not having a Justice Department?
So, and that was part of it. Ultimately, the reason that a Justice Department was conceived is because it was kind of a clunky relationship, because you would have the Attorney General would have to reach out to district attorneys, but having correspondence kind of funneled through the State Department, and not really having the Attorney General being in a position to really provide any guidance to them except in this weird, clunky way. Finally, somebody thought, well, why don't we just move all of this into a Justice Department
Okay.
that's headed by the Attorney General?
Okay.
Yeah. So, but the fact that it went that long, I think it was 1870 before the Justice Department was created, nearly 100 years into the government under the Constitution, is surprising.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But it also speaks to that the federal judiciary, the volume was building, but it still wasn't what it would become in later decades.
Well, it's kind of indicative of what we were saying earlier too. It's like the early republic was just kind of muddling through this as best it could.
Exactly.
No one could probably have foreseen an instance where like we need a dedicated Justice Department, but that's not demonstrated until Civil War. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this was considered a part-time position. It was with the expectation that the attorney general would likely continue in their private practice, which again, it's one of those things that to us, oh my gosh, that's a conflict of interest. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
But at the time, it was just seen as, well, we can't just have this guy sitting there with nothing to do. And we're not paying him a full salary like the other cabinet members. We're only paying him a smaller salary. So he's got to make his money somehow. So continue in your private practice. And for Pinkney, and this is one of those things, like at this time, you're seeing most of the attorneys general would live somewhere close to the federal capital so that they could go back home. They could come to DC when they needed to, but they weren't always there. I said that these were his official roles, but as we've seen with others who have held this post previously, the Attorney General could also serve as an unofficial counsel for the president on other matters, including but not limited to political matters. Now, since the office was a part time office, as noted by historian Leonard White, quote, the office of Attorney General was where the Attorney General happened to be. And one of the things that makes it convenient to have the Attorney General close to DC, but not necessarily there. If they had to get an opinion from the Attorney General, the expectation was, oh, well, we'll send it in the post, we'll get a quick response. They don't necessarily have to be here, they can work from home. Now, before I found the published version of Robert Ireland's dissertation on Pinkney, every other source that I found for Pinkney had absolutely no details about his time as Attorney General. They just had he became Attorney General, stayed in office for a couple of years, and then left.
I'm picking up a theme with Pinkney here.
But thankfully, we do get a little more detail from Ireland. So, when he assumed the office, Pinkney found 12 cases involving the government coming up in the next Supreme Court session as someone without a staff to help him. So, it was just the Attorney General, not even clerks, nothing.
You mean Pinkney's gonna have to work?
Well, so this was a heavy caseload. So Pinkney took advantage of an option, and I did not know this before. Apparently, there were a couple of other attorneys general who did this. He took advantage of an option that attorneys general had at the time and brought in additional help. In this case, it was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Pennsylvania, Alexander J. Dallas. Now, spoiler alert, Dallas will also be getting his own special episode for the Seat at the Table series as we go along. Pinkney took the 4 largest cases, with Dallas acting as his co counsel, while Dallas delivered the arguments for the other, more minor cases. One of the cases that Pinkney was involved in, the schooner exchange case, was significant in that, quote, it established for the first time the exemption of public warships from foreign jurisdiction and is regarded as the classic statement of the law of sovereign immunity as it applies to international affairs. So he did at least have this significant case that he worked on. In addition to appearing before the court as the Attorney General, Pinkney also appeared in 2 cases as a private lawyer. Again, this is weird. So, okay, well, I'm in this case as Attorney General. Okay, I'm going to take off that hat. Now I'm a private lawyer in this other case.
Mhm.
Both of the cases that he appeared as a private lawyer involved maritime insurance, which, as Pinkney's legal record shows, was rather of a specialty for him, and he was often found as counsel for insurance companies. As planned and as his predecessors had done, Pinkney spent a good amount of time while in office back in Baltimore attending to his private practice. Indeed, he often appeared before lower federal courts in Maryland as a private lawyer, which seemed to be more lucrative for him than appearing as counsel before state courts. So he was opting for cases that he would get more money from. In April 1812, a few months after taking office, Pinkney wrote to President Madison apologizing, quote, that my professional engagements in Baltimore were so pressing and important so as to put it out of my power to be where my duty requires. So even in this part-time gig, he's still having to send in a letter apologizing. I'm sorry, I can't really give this my all. I'm going to do better.
I'm so busy.
I'm so busy. Now, Pinkney was called upon by various administration officials to deliver his legal opinion. One stemmed from a request from Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton to provide guidance on enlistment laws, which was something that was quite important as the military geared up for war against Great Britain. Though it wasn't part of his official duties, Pinkney was also called upon by Congress to provide legal guidance from time to time, and even to draft legislation as requested by Congress for them to consider. It appears that he willingly agreed to carry out both of these unofficial duties and that President Madison was aware of him taking on these additional tasks. But as noted by Ireland, quote, very little is known of Pinkney's activities as a member of Madison's cabinet. He was probably not an influential spokesman in that body because of his frequent absences from Washington. He was, however, present when Madison and his cabinet deliberated whether to call for a declaration of war against Great Britain in May 1812. Pinkney was apparently, quote, opposed to a rupture with England unless France was included. So Pinkney was saying, why are we just declaring war on Great Britain? Let's declare war on France as well.
What? What?
Man that's hafted all his life said, let's go full force.
Okay, all right, hold on. My understanding is correct. The whole thing is Britain and France are at war with each other, Napoleonic Wars.
Mhm.
So it's already like it's already like a battle between two juggernauts. And Pinkney's idea was let's fight both of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which to be fair to him, we were experiencing diplomatic issues with France as well. And there were times that it was like, okay, are we going to go to war with one or the other or both?
I do know there were like war hawks in different administrations who would alternatively, like let's go get Britain or let's go get France.
Exactly.
Okay. But Pinkney's like, as Meredith says all the time, 4K.
4K no
But naturally, it seems like the other cabinet members were like, dude, you haven't been here for a while, so just trust us on this. We just need to go to war with one.
Part-time from your house, and even that's too hard.
And this is, oh my gosh, what if this was like his compensating? It was like, everyone thinks I'm a loser. Yeah, well, I want to fight both of them. That's how much of a man I am. Wow.
But he was overruled, and when the decision was made to call for a declaration of war against Britain and only Britain, It was Pinkney who drafted the declaration.
Was the word impressment in there?
Make sure to include the word impressment this time, Pinkney. Pinkney found himself busy during the 1813 term of the Supreme Court, but Ireland notes that, quote, the cases in which he argued were not of great significance. It should be noted that he appeared in 12 cases and acted as supporting counsel in 22 cases. Likewise, although he did work in his private practice, Ireland described the cases that he worked on during this time as insignificant as well. Possibly the fact that the nation was at war may have had something to do with that. People had other concerns than,
not dying.
Yeah.
Yeah. All in all, though not necessarily involved in many groundbreaking cases, it seems like Pinkney's tenure as Attorney General was going pretty well. As 1813 gave way to 1814, however, the situation for Pinkney changed. On January 5th, 1814, a bill was introduced in the House of Representatives by Representative John W. Taylor, Democratic Republican from New York, which would require the Attorney General to reside in Washington, D.C. during congressional sessions in order to answer any legal questions that may arise. Now, while that seems like a rather reasonable request from our point of view, and especially during a time of war, for Pinkney, that went against the entire reason he accepted the office.
Now I'm going to actually throw him a bone here, because this is 2023. We are of the era and the age of people who are like, I want to work remotely from home. I'll throw him a bone for this and only this.
I won't. It's not like they had. We're talking with Jerry, and he's in North Carolina right now. We can see each other. Like back then, you didn't have that technology to be like, "There's no reason this doesn't work well."
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, go to work, Pink.
And especially, and even thinking of the office beyond Pinkney. So, in the instance that you didn't have an attorney general that lived pretty close by, it may take some time to get an opinion back from them. And so it does make sense, while trying to carry on the nation's business during the congressional session, you would want somebody there who you could ask those questions to. So, I mean, it does make sense, but Pinkney was like, that wasn't what we agreed to. And so on January 25th, while still in Baltimore, Pinkney picked up his pen to write to President Madison about the bill. Quote, I find no fault with this bill, but as I'm quite sure that my professional pursuits in Baltimore and Annapolis will render it impossible for me to comply with it, I beg leave to tender to you the resignation of my office. I need not assure you, sir, that I surrender up this appointment, as I accepted it, with a deep sense of gratitude for the proof of confidence which it implied, and that, although the official ties which bound me to you are now at an end, those of affection and respect will endure forever.
That's a good 2-week notice.
Yeah. And, trying to make sure that you can use him as a reference moving forward, especially for Pinkney, who jumps offices and jobs every 5 minutes.
Methinks he learned his lesson with Samuel Chase.
Now, while it doesn't seem that Madison or the administration was behind the bill, and as noted by Ireland, it doesn't seem that they were against it as well. From Ireland, quote, Pinkney's many absences from the capital no doubt greatly inconvenienced the president, Congress, and the other agencies which were dependent upon the attorney general for legal advice. Madison wrote back on the 29th, accepting his resignation, though asserting that, quote, as the bill to which it refers has not yet passed into a law, I hope you will be able to prolong your functions till a successor can be provided, and at any rate to afford aid in the business of the U.S., particularly understood by you, at the approaching term of the Supreme Court. Now, it actually didn't take long for Madison to find a replacement, so on February 9th, 1814, William Pinkney left his post as Attorney General. Now, Pinkney wasn't bored after leaving the cabinet, for he was soon commissioned as a major in the Maryland militia. This position meant that he was on hand for the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th, 1814, where American forces attempted to hold off the British, who were marching towards Washington, D.C.
I actually lived right next to Bladensburg.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
when
When
you were
I
up in
Yeah, when I came up to, so I'm a doctoral candidate at University of Maryland, College Park, and I lived in Hyattsville. And if I wanted to go anywhere, if I was going to go to DC, for instance, I would 9 times out of 10 be passing through Bladenburg, and I would always see those, the historical markers and everything.
So William Pinkney was there. He was
Yeah,
actually a part of that battle.
old Pink Willie.
Not only was this battle a loss for the Americans, as we know, British forces did get to DC, the capital was burned. Pinkney was injured in the battle, and one account that I read described his condition as quote unquote severely wounded. But as with anything William Pinkney, I wasn't able to find out any details on what his injuries were or on his recovery, but he did recover. And by 1815, he was back arguing before the Supreme Court in a case involving maritime law. Though Pinkney found himself on the losing side, Associate Justice Joseph Story, who dissented from the ruling, asserted later that, quote, "Never in my whole life was I more entirely satisfied that the court was wrong in their judgment. I hope Mr. Pinkney will prepare and publish his admirable argument in that case. It will do him immortal honor." Indeed, it's from Story that we get the following description of Pinkney as he appeared before the highest court in the land. Quote, "The personal appearance of Mr. Pinkney was as polished as if he had been taken right from the drawer. His coat of the finest blue was nicely brushed. His boots shone with the highest polish. His waistcoat of perfect whiteness glittered with gold buttons. He played in his hand with a light cane. In short, he seemed perfectly satisfied with himself, and walked through the courthouse with an air of ease and abandon, arising from perfect self-confidence."
Wow.
Yeah, this was a guy who believed in himself.
Yeah. He's like, I like myself today. He wakes up and he's like, I get to be me.
And all of you are lucky enough to be in my presence.
Isn't that great for you that I get to be me?
Lances up the bench. Hi, Chase. Chase might be gone by now. I don't know.
And like he's like mid through like some sort of like speech or presentation during court, he'll just stop and see a reflection of himself in a window, be like, good looking man. But as like
So Pinkney was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and assumed his seat in the 14th U.S. Congress on March 4th, 1815. Pinkney remained in the seat until he was asked to once again serve as the diplomatic representative abroad. This tenure in Congress is only marked by one speech on the floor of the House about the treaty-making power, but it was apparently a good speech, as it was described by someone listening to it as, quote, "a very profound speech." But in early 1816, Pinkney was approached by the Madison administration about assuming not one, but two diplomatic missions, that of U.S. Minister to Russia and Special Minister to the Kingdom of Naples. Pinkney agreed and resigned his seat in the House on April 18th to begin making preparations to travel to Europe. Yes, he was accepting
I really thought that was going to be a hard no. Like, I only go to England. Like,
or he's like, I want to live in Baltimore. I don't want to go to work.
But he did accept. Now, I haven't been able to find confirmation of this, but just logistically speaking, I would imagine that he made the trip to Naples before continuing on to St. Petersburg.
Yeah, one can hope.
And it's also kind of backed up with that because it took him time to arrive in St. Petersburg, but he finally arrived there to assume that role on January 13th, 1817. This description is probably not going to come as much surprise, given what we've talked about thus far with Pinkney, but Lilich describes these missions as follows, quote, "His duties at these posts were not strenuous, and the responsibilities hardly commiserate with a man of his abilities. It can only be assumed that Pinkney, who drove himself hard while at the bar, desired a respite from his demanding practice."
Did he write this himself?
when has he ever driven himself
I
hard?
haven't seen him work hard at all.
It's like, I'm so tired.
I had to get up today.
I'll give him that. I'm sure the traveling was arduous back then.
Well, it's not like he was
but-
rowing the boat.
Nah.
No, I get it though. Yeah. I mean, we're
But
moving.
luckily, he was going into a relaxing new office.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the
I know.
process of
I'm like,
moving right now.
I'm currently considering paying professionals hundreds of dollars to move boxes for me. Like,
Yeah, it's just like, and we're taking our time with it in a good way. And since we're
yeah,
getting a head start on it,
Yeah.
mostly I have to say it's the Airwaves Meredith who's being awesome on everything here. So, but it's like we're taking our time with it in a good way, getting a head start. It's not so physically strenuous, and yet it's one of the most stressful things a person will ever do. So, I guess in that way, just
traveling to Russia.
traveling. I can give him a pass that this would be tiring. If anything, because of the jet lag.
There's
Their boat lag.
boat
Because
lag.
The
yeah,
boat.
I'm
Just
sorry.
worried he's gonna be impressed the whole time because he never got.
Oh yeah, he would probably be like just vindictive. Like every correspondence thereafter had the word "impressed" in it.
But he did have this easy job and lasted in it a little over a year. And then he resigned as U.S. Minister on February 14th, 1818.
Hold on.
Was the job done,
Hold on. Go
or
ahead.
did he just quit?
He just said, I've been here for a year. There really isn't that much to do. So,
Okay.
I'm
I
done.
I have a question. All right. Remind me, please. I've got most of the dates down here. He accepted this on 1815. He arrived in St. Petersburg in 1817. Do we know the month that he arrived?
It was January 13th.
Okay. Yeah, so he literally just spent a year there because I was gonna
Yeah.
say it takes months to get there, at this point in time.
So I guess we should say like good on him for that year, not including the travel time.
In this case, he went to work is what happened, and then got to work and said, "I quit."
I'm done.
Yeah,
It took so long to get here. If I want to get back in time, I might as well leave now.
this guy. I wish I had this guy's confidence that he can, with a straight
Just
face,
keep getting jobs.
and also without any sense of like humility or shame, be like, "I'm gonna quit. This has been too hard. I'll wait for my next job, which will inevitably come."
And so, he quits, he goes back to the US, and upon his return, he resumed arguing cases before the US Supreme Court,
Of course he does.
including one of the landmark cases of the Marshall Court, McCulloch v. Maryland. So Pinkney would serve as the legal counsel defending the cause of the Bank of the United States, alongside notable legal colleagues Daniel Webster and William Wirt, both of whom will also get their own episodes in this series. They were opposed by legal counsel representing the state of Maryland, which included Joseph Hopkinson, Walter Jones, and Luther Martin. So this case stemmed from the state of Maryland passing a law in 1818 to tax any bank issuing notes and bills not stamped by the state treasury $15,000 annually. This law was aimed directly at the recently rechartered Bank of the United States, which had a branch in Baltimore. When the cashier at the Baltimore branch, James William McCulloch, issued unstamped banknotes in defiance of the state law, the state sued, and the case made its way through the federal court system. Pinkney was the last legal counsel to appear before the court, and he spoke for 3 days. Ultimately, the court would unanimously rule in the bank's favor on March 6, 1819, affirming that, although not explicitly stated, the establishment of the Bank of the United States was a constitutional power of Congress, and as such, the state government had no authority to interfere in its operations by taxing it. So this had been building for decades. Was the Bank of the United States constitutional? And this was the Supreme Court saying, yes, it was. And Pinkney was one of the lawyers that had argued for the bank.
This is March when?
This is March 6th, 1819.
So this basically the constitutional legitimacy and supremacy of the federal bank over that of the states.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that the federal government could actually charter a national bank.
Okay. And did I hear you correctly say that there were still state currencies at this time?
Yes.
Yikes.
Yeah, so there were like 3 types of banks. There was a national bank, there were state chartered banks, and then there were some private banks, but the state chartered banks were typically the ones that were in more competition with the federal bank. So, at some point after his return to the US, Pinkney was elected by the Maryland state legislature as one of the state's 2 US senators. He assumed this role on December 21st, 1819. 6 weeks later, Pinkney found himself in the middle of the debate over the Missouri question. So, the issue of whether to admit Missouri as a slave state, as they had requested, had been before the Congress for the past year. So, this is a debate that's been raging for a year now. The debate mostly centered around the fact that in February 1819, Representative James Talmadge, Democratic Republican from New York, had introduced amendments which would limit slavery in Missouri, stipulating that no new slaves could be brought into the state and that children born to enslaved parents after statehood would be born free. So, at this point in the U.S. history, the slavery issue hadn't been completely absent, but by and large, it hadn't been directly a major part of the political debate in the federal capital in the past 30 years. But Talmadge's amendment put it front and center.
Is this Nebraska? I'm sorry.
No, this is
This is
Missouri.
I was,
Missouri.
I
Yeah.
said, that can't be.
I'm
right.
sorry, I don't read lips. So when you
Oh, no.
when you pointed it out to me, I was like,
Well, then I showed you what I wrote, and I was like, that's not any better. My
No.
handwriting. Right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
no,
it
it's
was
Missouri.
No worries.
bringing Missouri as a slave state. Yeah.
Yes. And so this debate was still going on when Pinkney took his seat in the Senate. And in mid February 1820, he rose from his seat to deliver a speech. Now, historian Richard Lillich makes a point of noting that Pinkney did not intend for his speech to be in support of slavery and did at one point during it denounce slavery. I was curious about this, so I found a copy of the speech and will share Pinkney's own words on the subject in a moment. But just to give a summary, the crux of his argument was that while Congress had the constitutional power to admit new states, the Constitution did not explicitly give Congress the power to, quote, specify the terms of their admission. So now let's go to Pinkney's words. And I think this is going to be part of our discussion at the end when we're talking about his legacy, what this actually means. So I quote, in a word, the whole amount of the argument on the other side is that you may refuse to admit a new state, and that therefore, if you admit, you may prescribe the terms. The answer to that argument is that even if you can refuse, you can prescribe no terms which are inconsistent with the act you are to do. You can prescribe no condition which, if carried into effect, would make the new state less a sovereign state than, under the Union as it stands, it would be. A territory cannot surrender to Congress by anticipation the whole or a part of the sovereign power which, by the Constitution of the Union, will belong to it when it becomes a state and a member of the Union. Its consent is, therefore, nothing. Now, I've got one more quote to read here, which is where he's directly talking about slavery. Quote, slavery, we are also told, is now rolling onward with a rapid tide towards the boundless regions of the West, threatening to doom them to sterility and sorrow, unless some potent voice can say to it, thus far thou shalt go, and no further. Slavery engenders pride and indolence in him who commands, and inflicts intellectual and moral degradation on him who serves. Slavery, in fine, is unchristian and abominable. Sir, I shall not stop to deny that slavery is all this and more. But I shall not think myself the less authorized to deny that it is for you to stay the course of this dark torrent by opposing to it a mound raised up by the labors of this portentous discretion on the domain of others, a mound which you cannot erect, but through the instrumentality of the trespass of no ordinary kind. not the comparatively innocent trespass that beats down a few blades of grass, which the first kind sun or the next refreshing shower may cause to spring again, but that which levels with the ground the lordliness trees of the forest and claims immortality for the destruction which it inflicts.
I feel like he was going strong in that first half, but like in the second half of that, I'm like, what are you talking about?
So basically, his argument is though slavery is a bad thing, a violation of states' rights is worse.
Oh, God. All right. So it's Jefferson's wolf by the ears thing again.
Yes. And this is that time. This is where those sentiments are there.
I hope anyone who's listening to this and doesn't think that and maintains that the Civil War was about states' rights is hearing what you just said there. Like states' rights about slavery. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's fundamentally always going to come. It comes back to that because that was the issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Pinky, you were almost there when he was talking about how much he hated and condemned slavery. I was like, all right, Pink Willie, but then no.
Yeah. So this will not come as a surprise. Pinkney's tenure in the Senate would not be a long one. Now, to be fair to him, this one wasn't by choice.
Oh, no.
Naturally, he had continued with his private practice and had argued a case on February 14th and 15th, 1822, before the Supreme Court. However, in the week prior, as he prepped for delivering these arguments, Pinkney grew increasingly, quote, sick and exhausted. The second day of his arguments, there were concerns that he would not continue as he was, quote, afflicted with severe hoarseness. However, Pinkney refused an offer from Justice Joseph Story to adjourn the proceedings until he recovered, and he finished up his argument. So he's like, I appreciate it, but let's just get this done.
Yeah.
That night, while in bed reading, Pinkney fainted, and he was treated by doctors the next morning. His wife, Ann Pinkney, was still in Baltimore, so Pinkney was attended to by Theophilus Parsons Jr.
Great name.
By the evening of the 17th, Pinkney was recovered enough that he instructed Parsons to inform Anne that she shouldn't make a special trip to come to tend to him. Unfortunately, he suffered a relapse, and William Pinkney passed away on the evening of February 25th, 1822, at the age of 57.
That's relatively young even for that period, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Supreme Court, for the first time in its history to that point, adjourned to pay their respects to Pinkney. And Representative John Randolph of Roanoke, despite being on opposite sides of the political fence at some points with Pinkney, delivered what was described as, quote, a stirring eulogy to him on the floor of the House. Pinkney was buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington. Though most folks upon his passing lauded him, a fellow Baltimore lawyer, John Neal, who was a critic of his, apparently took the opportunity in a novel that he published the year after Pinkney's passing to attack him. In the novel, titled Randolph, which, though admittedly written prior to Pinkney's demise, as was acknowledged in a footnote, attacked Pinkney's oratory as, quote, a compound of stupendous strength, feeble ornament, affected earnestness, and boisterous, turbulent declamation. As if that wasn't enough, Neal described Pinkney as follows, quote, he affects to be courtly and conciliatory at times, but nothing can be more ridiculous. All the training in the world would not make a gentleman of him. He neither looks, acts, speaks, sits, nor talks like one. He dresses too fashionably and too much, as if it were a serious matter with him. Some years ago, he was a notorious sloven, and I have seen him when the extreme gentility of his coat would not permit him to carry a pocket handkerchief on a hot day, all in a sweat, and actually foaming at the mouth. Yes, I myself have seen him at such a time wiping his nose and lips on the sleeve of his coat, and the next moment, it may be, while declaiming as if he would rupture all his arteries, stand and pick his nose with his finger in the judge's face. I have heard these things contradicted, but I have seen them, and I hold myself answerable for what I say. Y'all, his commentary on Pinkney went on for 8 pages.
All right.
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, this guy's named John Neal.
Send it to us.
John Neal, Neal. And the novel is called Randolph.
Oh my gosh, this is my favorite thing.
Yeah. I had to include that. I was like,
Yeah.
this guy went off
Yeah.
on him for 8 pages after he was dead.
Well,
Here's what. Go
you
ahead.
don't want to wait for 8 pages.
Seriously, you gotta fill up those pages somehow. Everyone knows the tyranny of
If
the
you
blank
are,
page.
if the footnote's true that he started writing this before he died, you gonna throw away all that effort?
I love that too. It's just like it's almost you saying like he picks his nose, he wipes his snot on his sleeves. How do you know? Cite your sources. Me. I saw it. I do love
Yeah.
like he's like he wouldn't like okay he wouldn't carry a handkerchief
Because
even though it
his
was
jacket was too fancy to put a handkerchief in. But then he's just walking around like wiping snot off his nose.
foaming at the mouth,
Foaming
being
at the
rabid.
mouth.
I love that one part. Someone was like when he finally called him Slav, I'm like, isn't that calling him lazy? And finally,
Yeah.
somebody said it.
Finally.
No, I'm sitting here with the grand irony that like towards the end there, it's like, well, you're sick. Like, let's let you take a break. No, I could
Yeah,
I could
same.
never. And it's like
Same.
that's all you've ever done.
This is the
time.
This is the guy who signs up for a marathon, does no training for it,
Mhm.
and then just bolts at top speed, and then plops over of heart attack.
Yeah. Maybe he'd
Yeah.
seen the first draft of this. And so when they're like, do you want to take a break? He's like, no,
Maybe
that's not what I do.
Yeah.
That would be slovenly. That's
That would
not
be
me.
slobbing of me. Look at this. I have 5 handkerchiefs in my pocket.
And he had like a face full of snot because he knew that novel was coming out, so he would not wipe it on
You're
his
like,
sleeve.
wipe your face. No.
No. What they're not going to say is that William Pinkney wipes his snot with his sleeve. Not today.
Not today.
On the phlegm, and that's what made his throat hoarse. Goodness.
So,
Special times.
Wow.
so in terms of legacy, there's really not much for Pinkney.
We can call him William Picknose. William Pinkney, the nose picker.
Oh god.
Oh gosh.
All
So-
right. Lasting legacy.
The only thing that I have in terms of legacy is one item in relation to one of his children. So sadly, a little over 6 years after Pinkney's death, their 7th child, Edward Coote Pinkney, died of tuberculosis in Baltimore at the age of 25. Now, the young Pinkney had been a poet, but he hadn't achieved much claim prior to his death. However, thanks in part to the admiration of such noted literary figures as Edgar Allan Poe and John Greenleaf Whittier, Pinkney's poetry gained more acclaim posthumously, to the point that he has been dubbed, quote, the first poet of the South. But that is all that I have in terms of legacy for William Pinkney.
Oh my gosh. This guy delivered.
Yeah.
I had fun.
I had so much.
Well, and considering that I started this research and only had like
Yeah.
barely able to find anything,
Well,
and
testament-
we were able to
yeah.
get this.
No,
Applause.
that's awesome.
No, seriously, Jerry, that's very impressive. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
And so, with that, let's go ahead and start talking about his legacy, starting with our whole picture round. So, this round looks at the overall career and character of the cabinet member. And now each of us can award up to 10 points. And since there are 2 of you, your points will basically, both of you can award up to 10 points, but then I'll divide by 2. And I've already got the spreadsheet set up for that. So,
Right.
what are your thoughts on his overall career and character?
He failed upward a lot.
Is it even failure? It's just inaction.
You're right. The guy
So,
that he just okay, I've got it. He is the dude, if you've ever seen the movie Office Space, he's the guy that slips through the cracks, never gets fired, never does anything, and no one really likes him, but he's just always there. He's like, I believe you have my stapler. You know, I had my desk by the window, and I could see the squirrels outside, and now I can't. And I'd like to have my stapler back, please. Like he just flies and okay, never mind.
No, you're good. Um,
Just cut
I
that.
got what you meant. No. I'd say maybe like a 4.
I would, yeah,
Well, because I mean, like,
Yeah.
regardless of the shortness of tenure in the different offices, he never did anything particularly bad. Like,
That's true.
I know we laughed at him over the impressment, but as we all discussed, like, really, if Britain's saying no, like, how much can you do? And he did seem to pass some fairly influential, or play a part in some fairly influential Supreme Court cases. So I don't. It's not a career of nothing. It's just a lot with, oddly enough, not a lot to show for the number of positions.
I would agree. All jokes aside, the fact that like it goes back to what I was saying about when Washington, tapped him. It was like the implication of that is undeniably that he had some reputation and some renown such that he could be sought after. So that has to be acknowledged. Like as Meredith is saying, we're not seeing the reasons why. Clearly, there was a reason why he kept getting the jobs. So no one is looking at this guy saying he's a flake, he's a failure. He keeps getting elected. He keeps getting these jobs. And it's like when we said for Alexander, at some point, even if I notoriously don't like Alexander, even I have to say, but the dude won every battle. So with this, it's like he kept getting these jobs, so that clearly implies some sort of confidence in him. Yeah. That's a really good point. I'd probably say 4 because I can't. I'd like to give him more, but then I start getting the pushback from everything. I was like, yeah, but what did he do?
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd say 4. I'd agree with that.
So 4 from both of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So 8 back down to 4.
So I'm actually going to go with 4 as well, and I think that you get to the points here. You can't say that his overall career was a failure. I mean, he served in multiple diplomatic postings, he served in multiple state offices, federal offices, he served in the legislative branch, he served in the executive branch. This is a guy who was a major player, and his legal career. He was one of the acclaimed legal scholars at the time. He was seen as being this leader of the legal profession. So this was a guy and especially McCullough v. Maryland. That is a
Yeah.
really big case. That is one of the top cases of the Marshall Court. So the fact that he had a role in that and on the side that won is important.
I just as you mentioned that, it just occurs to me. A lot of people talk now about the hyperpolarization of our politics, and it's true. He actually strikes me as someone who is maybe if an early indicator or an early example of someone who was kind of trying to be middle of the road, because you mentioned how he was a protege of a Federalist judge, but he himself, if I'm remembering, he was
Was a
a
Democrat.
Democratic Republican, and so that's in the political parlance of the time, that's more of a decentralized or an advocate of decentralized government, but then argues for the validity and supremacy of the American bank, and then argues against the idea of setting conditions for the admission of states into the union. So but it strikes me it's not necessarily flip flopping. He might be someone who we would see on that political spectrum is in the middle.
Yeah. Well, and it speaks to the complexities of it wasn't just, you were either this or this.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It was more complex then as now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the thing. So, he definitely he had a great career, but then you also have to go back to, well, what did he really accomplish?
Yeah.
In terms of the law, in terms of being a lawyer, he did accomplish some great things. As a politician, not quite as much. So, he's definitely not at the very bottom, but he's not getting high marks in this category.
Yeah, but I think what's significant about that too is that it's a reminder, not, or it's a reminder for us to push back against, be on guard against, or not fall under too much of the spell of big man history, or not big or great man history.
Yeah.
Because what I love about what you're doing with this series is it's prosopography. The idea of we're taking these peripheral figures that don't get kind of swallowed into the grand narrative of big names and stuff like that, but it shows the complexity of our early politics, of our history, and it shows the complexity of just human relations and government and politics. And it's just like with my stuff, when I'm looking at like Roman generals and commanders and stuff, and you have these names that pop up, and just because they're not recorded as doing great things does not necessarily mean that these people are losers or failures. Not every historical figure is going to be this huge mover and shaker like a Washington and a Jefferson. That doesn't mean it's a failure.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is the case. You're the content thing.
You're just there.
You're just there.
Yeah.
And that's what happens sometimes.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And thank you. I do, with this, part of the intent behind the series is to help us better understand, because there's so much out there about the president.
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
the president could not have done what they did. Madison could not have done what he did without Pinkney as Attorney General,
Right.
or Monroe as Secretary of State, or all these other figures. If he hadn't had them in place, whatever he achieved, he wasn't going to be able to do, because you've got to have these folks too.
Right.
And it shows, a different perspective, even at the time, that because his tenure was largely during the War of 1812, courts were still running, things were still going, the Supreme Court was still holding cases.
That's an excellent.
And so, it speaks to that it's beyond, it isn't just that you've got this one big thing going on, there's so much else going on. But yeah, so and I think that's a perfect segue. So, right now he's at an 8 after our whole picture round. So let's transition to the go-getter round. This round looks at the impact of the cabinet member during their time in the cabinet. And just like with the last round, we can each award up to 10 points.
He was in cabinet during the War of 1812, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going back to my notes here.
And then a lot of the big Supreme Court cases were while he was Attorney General.
Okay.
So actually, when he was Attorney General, there weren't that many big cases. So McCulloch v. Maryland was after. Yeah.
Wait a minute. He was in the cabinet multiple.
He was in it for Washington. He was in it for Jefferson. He was in it for Madison.
Well, and actually, so his other offices prior to Attorney General, only as Attorney General was he in the cabinet.
Got it.
His other postings were diplomatic postings.
So that really.
All right.
Yeah, and so
that really
this
throws
is
the window.
This is talking about the period. So his tenure was from December 11th.
Yep.
Yeah, December 11th, 1811
Yep.
to February 9th, 1814.
Got it. I got it. Yep. Yeah. So February 1814.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. All right. So I apologize for my. So he resigned February 1814. Okay. I apologize for the background noise. I'm flipping through my notes.
No worries.
All right. So what I see here in my notes. What you got? So he accepts in December. Okay. Yeah. This is when he's still like, yeah, that can't be too busy.
Mhm.
Part-time gig. He's not paid a full salary. Able, allowed, and expected to keep his private practice. He could be a counselor or advisor to the president. He ended up having a heavy court load. So then he brought on subordinates to help delegate, but he kept 4 cases,
which were considered the biggest.
the big ones, including a maritime case, the schooner case.
Mm-hmm.
He advised on issues of naval enlistment, consulted on issues of legislation for Congress. He opposed war with only Britain. He wanted to fight France too, was overruled, and confirm if I'm wrong on any of these, or correct me. But when war with Britain was decided, he then helped draft the Declaration of War. He was active in law during the War of 1812, but I have on here not of much consequence.
Yeah.
But then there was a law that was proposed to require the Attorney General to reside in Washington, and that's when he resigns.
Yes.
Oh boy.
3?
All
Not much going on there.
right, yeah, to review then. All right, so he starts his tenure saying, this isn't going to be that hard, right? And then does do some stuff, but then wanted to fight 2 superpowers instead of 1. Then did some stuff that didn't matter, and then was told he had to come to work today, and that's when he quit. I will say a 3 as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Pinkney just doesn't strike you as a go-getter.
No.
And especially in his tenure in the cabinet. And, as we said, because he wasn't there in Washington, even though he was there for, the big decision to go to war
Yeah.
or to request to go to war, he really didn't have that much impact in terms of the cabinet. He was turned to for advice, not only by the administration, but also Congress. So he does have some influence,
Yeah.
but it's just not a lot. And especially when you start the office by saying, well, this isn't going to be that hard, and you end when you're asked to come to Washington, I think I'm going to match y'all on the 3 because I think it does reflect on he just, and part of it was the nature of the office, but also the whole reason he took the office was the nature of the office.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was promised a part-time gig, and you're making me come to work now? That's just unbelievable. I
If you remember from that letter where he was saying that he would accept it, he said something along the lines of, I don't think it's going to interfere with my private practice
Yeah.
and it may actually help. So he was seeing it as a personal benefit to him, which we've talked about this
Yep.
with other guests, with other attorneys general. Think about if you're in private practice and your opponent, the person on the other side
Yep.
is the attorney general.
Yeah.
That intimidation factor, or the judge, oh, well, that's the attorney general right there.
Yeah.
Maybe we should listen to them. So it's odd.
Yeah, and it strikes me that this also is not something that's new with him, because if I recall, he yes, in 1805, when he was appointed or invited to be the Attorney General of Maryland, he thought that was when he thought it was inconvenient and disadvantageous. So
Yeah.
even then, so this is 10 years or like 6 years earlier. This is not an anomaly.
Yeah.
This is his typical behavior for him to look at it as like, what's good for me here, which is fine. But I am a romantic in the regard that, like, especially in this period, I look at these guys with the expectation of, like, shouldn't they just be enamored with the idea of public service? Isn't that the cool thing to do?
Yeah.
But apparently
Yeah.
not.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's a loyalist. Well, no, he's not.
Yeah.
No, we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. Which this is a perfect segue to our next round, the hot seat round. This round discusses any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the cabinet member.
Well, he's flicking boogers on judges.
Yeah, so this disgrace does not have to be during their tenure of office in the cabinet, and this is where we can detract points. So where we were awarding points before, we can detract up to 10 points each.
I feel compelled to jump in here because I remember I was really intrigued by his speech and arguments regarding Missouri, and I fundamentally disagreed with him even before. Like, okay, I'm on board with him condemning slavery. Good job, but I thought that was I disagreed, because when he says, like, the Union, if I'm remembering, he says the federal government has the ability to approve or reject, petitions for admission into the Union, but it does not have the ability to set the standards for the admission or the rejection of admission to the Union. which I found to be kind of contradictory language or rhetoric or contradictory logic because by definition, if you are the ruling power that is setting the terms for admission or rejection into the union, you are implicitly the one that sets the terms. There are terms by which one is accepted, by which one is not accepted. And so if you are the ruling body, it seems to be implicit that you're going to be the ones that set terms. And so his whole argument, like the government can't do that. Yes, it can by virtue of it being the one that has the final say.
Yeah.
It's just that's like me. That's like a student telling me that even though I give the grades in the class, I don't have the right to determine what gets the grades. Like, well, how am I supposed to do it then? It's contradictory.
Yeah.
And then I will always be that person, even though maybe I've been told before, like we have to like keep things into context. But I really just don't have a lot of respect for the people that are saying, well, slavery's bad, but what are you going to do? I don't like that.
Yeah.
And I think that but again, this is another correlation here. He's maybe a little bit wishy-washy. He never takes a stance that requires him fundamentally to do something, because then the impressment thing, the Jay Treaty, it's just like wherever he goes, nothing happens. And so I'm going to deduct, I'll deduct 6 points from him.
That's a lot.
Yeah, because he didn't do a lot. And what we see of him doing is he won't take the step to do anything. He is the poster child of someone who had a lot of potential and didn't do anything with it. And I think that's what John Neal said, something like that about him. Walks into it was some guy with maybe it was the Justice Story who was like, this guy walks in and he's got a lot of potential and he knows it.
Mm.
Well, and that was part of the reason why I included that, knowing that we'd have the John Neal description, because I think it really does. Both of those tell us something about Pinkney and how he came across.
I'll put it like this. Since we're all North Carolinians here, we know our state motto is esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. And I don't think Pinkney lived by that.
Yeah.
I think Pinkney liked to seem rather than to be. He liked to look like he was something important than actually to do something important. But I really want to know what Meredith thinks.
Well, I guess I'm just trying to weigh. I guess I'm thinking back to like the whole picture where we're like, he didn't do a lot, but he didn't do anything bad. So now here in the hot seat, I'm trying to determine like, well, how much do you penalize someone from inaction?
Okay, that's a good
that
point.
did not have negative impact.
And then you can just say like any disgraceful behavior. Yeah.
And I do agree about the Missouri thing and everything like that. And I mean, for me, really, that's the only thing that stands out, because everything else we look back at is like, okay, well, he didn't get impressment into the treaty. He also didn't push it to a point that Britain said, okay, let's go to war. There are just a number of things where he didn't take it to a point where something bad happened.
Yeah.
And is that disgraceful?
That is an excellent point.
I mean, so for Missouri, because obviously that's very important, and it would be interesting to see what it would have been like if we had more politicians at the time, not default to the Jefferson, like, well, what are we going to do? Or it's too late, or like kick it to the next generation. I'd be curious to see what happened. But at the same time, he died and was out of like really a lot of more of the forward momentum to it. It would have been interesting to see what he would have done as this continued to the climax of the Civil War. 3?
You know what? Meredith makes really good points. I think I was too excited about taking a pot shot at him because he wipes his boogers on his nose. Meredith's right. If the criteria for the hot seat category is disgraceful behavior or actions, and my whole thing was what he didn't do, then I can't hold that against him. That's just not the criteria of the round. So I probably will. I'll scale back. I'll take away 4 points instead of 6, and I'll defend that by pointing out the fact of when he's getting an appointment to one of the highest offices in his nation, he still says, I don't want to go to work, or I want to do this part-time. And when he gets pushed to actually come to work, he's like, well, I'm quitting. So that'll be my compromise, in the sense, like, you're right. I'm going to give 2 of those points back, but I'm going to maintain a little bit more harsh criticism. So 4 and then 3, yeah.
Yeah, and one thing to say here, so, of course, Pinkney was from Maryland, which was a slave state. I didn't find anything that said that he actually enslaved individuals.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't find anything confirming that he didn't. The fact that he did speak against slavery does not necessarily, I mean, we've seen other prominent American leaders at the time who would say, "Oh, slavery is awful, it's an evil," and they would enslave individuals. That said, and I think both of you bring up this point, the Missouri thing is the classic argument that folks were making in that time and for the next 40 years leading up to the Civil War, that the federal government just, you can't regulate slavery. It doesn't say in the Constitution that you can. However, if you're asking for membership in something,
Yep.
you go in knowing that there are certain rules
Right.
and you've got to abide by those. And so the argument is, how can you argue that the organization that this state is trying to join, or it's trying to join as a state, cannot have some conditions
Mhm.
to that?
Right.
So, and I think Pinkney, and the thing is, like, part of it is just the nature of, he was a lawyer. He was a great lawyer, and lawyers have to argue both sides of the case, depending on who their client is. They're going to argue one way or the other, but it's important for a good lawyer to kind of know both arguments so that they can really work the side that they're being charged to argue.
Mhm.
And I get that Pinkney was there, but in this capacity, serving as a legislator, I think we've got to mark some off of him. So I'm not going to go too harshly. I'm going to join Meredith in that 3, just because, and especially speaking of context, speaking of, that we've got some cabinet members who are really egregious in how they approach public service, harming others, using that to their own benefits. There are some folks that we're going to encounter that are even higher up on that, or with the slavery issue, who are going to be very active in trying to ensure that the continued enslavement of individuals. So we can't, I'm not inclined to go too harsh, but I do think that he deserves some points marked off here for that.
Yeah.
And so with that, he now stands at a 7.5. He's got an opportunity to pick up some more points. So, we talked about that December 1811 to February 1814. So rounding that time of his tenure in office as a cabinet member, that gets him 2 more points. We do have an option for bonus points. Pinkney does not meet any of those criteria because he only served in one full-time cabinet position. So folks who serve in more can earn a bonus point. He doesn't. He only served in the Madison administration, so he doesn't earn the bonus point for serving in more than one administration. And as we've discussed, he was not ambitious enough to go for the presidency. That would have required too much work. So he doesn't get that bonus point either.
He would have quit.
I know.
Yeah.
5 days in, I'm
I know.
done.
The moment he's like, "Oh, you can abdicate to the VP." Okay. Like,
Let's do that.
there's a backup plan.
And he's the kind of guy that's like, but I still get like a pension, right?
I can still live here. I can still.
Yeah, he's the guy that's just
Oh
like,
no! The moment they'd be like, "Well, you need to come live in the White House," he'd be like, "Nah,
No.
my private practice."
we actually have seen a similar sentiment to that recently. That I remember during the Trump administration, they did that, and he
Oh
he
yeah.
threw a hissy fit because he was like, "What do you mean
Yeah.
I have to go live in the White House? I don't wanna." They're like, "Sir, get your ass in here."
you really do have to go there.
You do.
The job.
You're not
But
gonna-
so William Pinkney ends up with a total score of 9.5.
How does that compare?
out of
That
how many he could have had.
a lot more. Lot more. This is actually so John Breckenridge scored a 7. I think that's our lowest. William Bradford scored a 9. So he is now in 3rd place.
Well, I want to take another point away then.
No.
All of those were attorneys general. So this speaks to the office was not, and both of them served very short terms. So we're kind of seeing a theme here.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But we will see if the theme continues with our last question. So, Meredith and Dustin, after all I've shared about William Pinkney's life and career and what we've discussed, do you think that this cabinet member is notable enough or impactful enough to earn a seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars?
Absolutely not.
No.
I will,
and he would view it as an inconvenience to be there.
Yeah.
If we invited him, he'd say, well, what's the workload? Can I stay home?
Where is this table?
Where's the table? Do we do anything?
What kind of chair am I going to get? Furthermore, I'm going to tell you, from what John Neal said is true, we could not let him have a seat at the table because he would start wiping his boogers underneath the
table. The table would be messed up very quickly.
Yeah, just like those gross kids we all knew in school, and it's just like, stop that! Stop like under the table. That's gross. This is who he is.
This is him.
He has not earned table privileges.
Well, we are sorry, William Pinkney. You're going to have to do a bit more to earn that seat at the table, and I don't think you really want to. So I don't think he would be too disappointed.
Yeah, he would just say, well, it's too hard anyway. I don't want to do it.
For your part, I hope that you have not been disappointed by this experience and learning about William Pinkney.
No, this has been great.
This has been so cool. I was excited. I knew I was going to have fun, but I didn't know I was going to have this much fun. This is this is to your credit that, again, this is how impressive it is that you're taking these peripheral figures and making such an engaging narrative and discussion out of it. I had so much fun.
Well, I cannot thank y'all enough for being here, for joining me for this episode. And likewise, I'm looking forward to learning more about these successors to Alexander the Great that don't get that the Great
I know.
attached to their names.
That don't meet the Alexander standard.
I was about to say, I don't know if over time, if it's going to be me lessening my standards, or if at the end of the show, we're going to be like, it was all terrible.
And we've ended up lowering our standard, yeah.
It will be interesting to see if you do get to folks, oh, well, they were wiping their nose on their sleeve and picking their nose.
Well, I know some of them do pretty horrific things that we'd be like, I'd rather you just kind of be gross.
There's one guy, one thing I love about this field is with the Greeks, and the Romans too, because they just only had so few actual names to choose from, that you get a lot of nicknames to distinguish them. And there's a couple of them. There's like one guy's name, Hook Nose. This other guy, there's one guy that's named Sausage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And there's one guy that basically his name sounds cool, but it was kind of a joke. His name was called Demetrius the Besieger of Cities, because he never could conquer the city. He would just besiege it and could never get it. He loved besieging, but not taking a city. Yeah. We got some good ones. Yeah, coming up. Yeah. And I don't know, Meredith. We might have to repay the favor and invite Jerry to come on the Alexander Standard.
I know. We'll just send you a list of the nicknames, and whichever seems most interesting, that's
there you go.
I love it.
Yeah,
I would love that.
Well, I want to say it's been an honor. Thank you for inviting us to this.
Well, and likewise, thank y'all so much for being here. And audience, please, once you get done listening to this episode, check out the Alexander Standard. I will have information on the actual episode for the episode page for this episode. I'll have information on social media, or just search for the Alexander Standard. You'll be able to find it, and I highly recommend giving it a listen. And with that, I'm going to close this out. Thank y'all so much for being here. Thank you to our audience for listening. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of the new Medal of Honor podcast from Evergreen Podcasts, brought to you in partnership with the National Medal of Honor Museum. In each 3-minute episode, we'll learn about a different service member who distinguished him or herself through an act of valor. We'll include stories from the Civil War to Iraq and Afghanistan, and from all branches of the military. We'll talk about service members who were overlooked for the medal at first due to their race or religion, and about those who were celebrated at the time. We'll hear stories of soldiers like Audie Murphy, future Hollywood star who mounted a burning tank to hold off German infantry in World War II. And people like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, a Civil War Army doctor and the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor so far. Learn about these heroes and more wherever you get your podcasts.